Hi, I'm Ben from thePinkLens.com and welcome to the third video in my history of LGBT cinema. Today I'm going to be looking at the period of 1981 to 1994 when the AIDS crisis was ravaging the LGBT community. The 70s had been a decade of decadence for LGBT people. With their newfound liberation, separatism had flourished. Radical feminism was growing in popularity, while the newly legal bathhouses and sex clubs were becoming a normalised part of being a gay man. But while everybody else in the Western world started the 1980s with a period of wealth and stability, the tide changed very quickly for LGBT people. Initially, it was business as usual. Campy comedies like Tootsie and Victor Victoria celebrated queerness and flamboyance, albeit through the safety of a heteronormative lens. Fassbender made his most iconic movie, Carrel, in which a Belgian sailor engages in a whole plethora of sexual depravity in the French town of Brest, shot like a Technicolor 50s thriller on luscious but stylised film sets. But Carrel proved to be his final film, with the controversial German director dying of a drug overdose in 1982. The death of the man who was probably the world's most famous gay filmmaker coincided with the first reported cases of gay cancer, the disease that would later become known as AIDS. While the gay community were quick to realise that they were at the start of what would become an international pandemic, the straight media, politicians and public were slow to follow suit. With the disease suddenly branding gay men as social pariahs, it can be no coincidence that films that featured gay men suddenly started to disappear from film screens, with only really the Brazilian film Kiss of the Spider-Woman making any real impact for the next few years. During this period, however, films that featured lesbian stories were beginning to become commercial successes. In some, the lesbian stories were played down, like The Colour Purple and later Fried Green Tomatoes, but in others, their depictions were positioned front and centre. From the deep south romanticism of Desert Hearts to the bristling sexual tension of Personal Best. Thrillers like The Hunger and Basic Instinct would sexualise lesbian sex for a heterosexual male audience, but some of Hollywood's new generation of leading ladies would even step up to playing lesbian roles, like Uma Thurman in Even Cowgirls Get the Blues. It would take a few years for the public panic about HIV and AIDS to reach the UK, and with Derek Jarman now established as one of the country's biggest directors, gay stories were being told on screen. While the gay director retrospectively outed painter Caravaggio and England's King Edward II in his punk biopics, Merchant Ivory tackled E.M. Forster's gay period drama Maurice, and Rupert Everett starred in Another Country, the biopic of Guy Burgess, who would become one of the Cambridge spies and was also gay. Elsewhere, Gary Oldman starred as Joe Orton opposite Alfred Molina in Prick Up Your Ears, the story of the renowned British playwright who was murdered by his male partner.
Currently, I am working on a screenplay for 4 boys who are nudging Jesus Christ for the position of #1 most famous person ever.
No. These are normal, healthy boys.
Oh, but they're all very pretty.
By the sea, by the sea, by the beautiful sea, you and me,
And later, gender-bending historical odyssey Orlando saw Tilda Swinton step into the limelight as a champion for LGBT rights after the diagnosis and rapid decline of her longtime collaborator Jarman. Most significantly, 2 of the biggest LGBT films of the period would come from the UK. My Beautiful Laundrette saw Daniel Day-Lewis star as a young member of a skinhead gang who falls in love with a young Pakistani man living in London.
Why don't people like laundrettes? Because they're like toilets. This could be a Ritz among laundrettes.
A laundrette as big as the Ritz. Oh yes.
While director Neil Jordan made The Crying Game, a romance that explores gender against the backdrop of the IRA.
No way.
You said anything, Dale?
Girl has to draw the line somewhere.
I want to change you to a man.
Why?
It's a secret.
Back in Hollywood, the AIDS crisis was seeing scores of stars being forced out of the closet because it became increasingly clear that they were suffering and dying of AIDS. Hollywood heartthrob Rock Hudson, Psycho star Anthony Perkins, eccentric piano megastar Liberace, Carrel himself, Brad Davis, and countless others would be slain by the disease, as well as French philosopher and film theorist Michel Foucault. The disease would first appear on screen in TV movie An Early Frost in 1985, but then significantly in Parting Glances, in which newcomer Steve Buscemi played a young man dying of the disease while his friends struggled to deal with his oncoming death. While movies like The Thing depicted HIV and AIDS in a metaphorical way, it took until 1989 for Hollywood to stop depicting it as a plague-like punishment and start being sympathetic towards people with AIDS. Longtime Companion depicted AIDS from the perspective of a group of gay men for the first time, to much acclaim, and earned Bruce Davidson an Oscar nomination.
We've been given your name as a contact for John Deacon. Your friend has pneumonia. He has a high fever.
How high?
105. Then they don't even tell him what they've told me and David.
I'm so sorry.
It's just not fair. It's not fair.
Then, the adaptation of Randy Schultz's novelisation of the early days of the crisis, And the Band Played On, was adapted into a movie with an all-star cast, before AIDS finally got the full Hollywood treatment with Jonathan Demme's Philadelphia, which would win Tom Hanks an Oscar. The year previously, Demme came under great criticism from the LGBT community for depicting the killer in The Silence of the Lambs as trans. Accused of depicting LGBT people in a negative light, his response was Philadelphia, a movie that depicted the injustices surrounding a man fired from his job for having AIDS. Although the film positions itself from a heterosexual perspective, looking in on the LGBT community, it was still a definitive landmark moment for queer cinema, which saw both gay people and people with AIDS embraced by the mainstream for the very first time.
Everybody in this courtroom is thinking about sexual orientation, sexual preference, whatever you want to call it. Who does what to whom and how they do it. I mean, they're looking at Andrew Beckett. They're thinking about it. They're looking at Mr. Wheeler, Miss Conine, even you, Your Honor. They're wondering about it. Trust me, I know that they are looking at me and thinking about it. So let's just get it out in the open. Let's get it out of the closet. Because this case is not just about AIDS, is it? So let's talk about what this case is really all about. The general public's hatred, our loathing, our fear of homosexuals.
It was around this time that the tide began to change for people suffering from the disease. Medication had improved, detection was swifter, and the public was becoming more widely educated about how to stop its spread. Though the battle against AIDS would continue to the present day, it no longer meant a death sentence. But these changes came too late for many, including Derek Jarman, whose final film Blue was released in 1993. Having lost his sight in the final stages of his life, he could only now see the colour blue. The movie, which is a poetic soundscape of verse and prose, plays alongside an entirely blue screen and is considered by critics to be both his greatest work and the most definitive cinematic work to emerge from the era. Probably the most enduring and iconic movie made during the pandemic wasn't even a dramatisation of events. Documentary Paris is Burning captured the drag balls of New York City, in which the African American, Latino, gay and transgender communities are observed in their element, featuring footage of the balls and interviews with some of the key figures from the competing houses. Featuring figures of all races, genders and sexualities, this legendary movie would go on to shape the very bedrock of drag culture, having massive influence on RuPaul and today's Drag Race.
To be the mother of the house, you have to have the most power. Take a real family. It's the mother that's the hardest worker, and the mother gets the most respect. As far as my naming my house, the House of Ninja. Ninjas hit hard, they hit fast, an invisible assassin, and that's what we are. We come out to assassinate.
The House of LaBeija is the legendary house above all of them. I have the most members, I'm the most popular. New York City is wrapped up in being LaBeija. So.
With cinema finally depicting the stories of people with AIDS on screen, the early 90s was a sad time for LGBT people, both on and off screen. But the positivity suddenly started to trickle through again in 1994 with the release of a small Australian movie that depicted 3 drag queens and a bus. The end of this period also saw the rise of directors Gus Van Sant, Pedro Almodovar and Greg Araki, but I'll be exploring all of these in my next video, in which we see the LGBT community go through rebirth in the 90s, recovering, rebranded and rejuvenated. Thanks for watching, and be sure to visit thepinklens.com for all the news, reviews and features about LGBT cinema that you could possibly ever need. Until next time folks,